Or was it just ambition? You are listening to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show and my conversation with the author of Mademoiselle, Coco Chanel, and the Pulse of History, Rhonda K. Garelick. Visit us online at HalliCasser-Jayne.com.
Well, I think the answer is a complicated braiding of all of the things you just mentioned. It began with her understanding that wealthy and powerful people could help her sell her clothes. Very simply, she invented a kind of word-of-mouth advertising before anyone knew what that was. She found beautiful society women and said, here, I'm giving you my clothes for free. Just wear them to parties. And they would wear them, and people would say, that's gorgeous, where did you get it? And then her name would be bandied around. And slowly, it became acceptable to know one's dressmaker, which, of course, up until Chanel was unheard of. People didn't socialize with mere dressmakers. But then, quite a bit more important than that, I think, is that she found herself among the modernist artists of Europe. And that was not just for social climbing reasons. There, I have to give her credit. She was truly an artist, and people like Picasso, Diaghilev, Misha Serre, Stravinsky, the list goes on and on. They recognized in her a kindred spirit. And because artists are always less concerned about social class than other people, they didn't mind welcoming into their circle a girl with no background. And she wound up collaborating with a lot of these artists on major productions that she costumed.
She couldn't draw, by the way, could she?
No, Hal.
I mean, that's the most amazing part of this whole story, if you ask me, from an artist's point of view.
That's correct. Chanel had no real couturier training. She could sew, but she could not draw a pattern, and she couldn't do the complicated stitching that couture requires. She would mold dresses and outfits on models, live models, using fabric. She was more of a sculptor or of an artisan than she was a traditional fashion designer.
Unreal. Now, here's where your book is different from every other book that I've read about Coco Chanel, and why I love your book so much. Because you do put this woman in step with the historical time that she came from, and I think that really explains her in a depth that we probably never would have understood prior to that. Let's look at World War I and Chanel, and let's talk about her and politics and World War I and diplomacy. It's a lot to throw at you, but I want to get that in here because I think it's so essential to her story.
Yes, thank you. That's actually a big part of the story that I don't think has been addressed. To begin with, she spent World War I in Deauville, where Boy Capel brought her to protect her from the front. And it was there that she began making her jersey costumes, her jersey ensembles. And jersey was a cheap fabric that had been used for men's underwear. There weren't a lot of materials available. And at that very time, women were starting to work in a way they hadn't before World War I. They were doing jobs that men had done before, and simple, easy, lightweight outfits were crucial to these women. And there was Chanel providing exactly such outfits at a time when they were needed. She saw the need, she understood the relationship between what was going on in the world politically and what material culture, what women's clothes needed to do to respond. It was also a time, because women were entering the workplace, when a lot of the restrictions on women's freedoms were falling away. Women were suddenly going out. I'm talking about upper-class women, of course. Mm-hmm. They were going out alone in public. They were working. They were doing exercise. They were replacing men in jobs, and they didn't care as much for the old decorum, and that allowed Chanel more social mobility, but she also responded with outfits that corresponded to a less constrictive view of women's existence.
Unreal, because I think anybody who can sit in the midst of what is going on and somehow come up with that little key, right, about women and women changing lives and say, there it is. There's that little niche that I can find a place for myself in. Can you imagine what her mind was like? Could you imagine being inside her head?
I feel as though I came as close as I could. I tried often to think about how she thought. And I think it's the genius of an observer, somebody who spent many years forcibly retired from the world as a child and just bided her time watching, thinking.
Sensitive beyond all imagination.
Yes.
Back to the men in her life.
Okay.
There were many.
Yes.
There were some really extraordinary ones. You want to talk about that?
Sure. It's hard to know where to begin. After the death of her beloved Capel, Chanel kind of plunged into a life of quite wild and exciting dating. It's true. She dated a Romanov Duke, Grand Duke Dmitry Romanov, who had been a direct descendant of the Tsars and was the nephew of the last Tsar of Russia. And he was in exile in Paris at the time. He was also one of the two murderers of Rasputin. and so had a quite nefarious past, but he opened to her imagination the beauty and the wonders of the Romanov dynasty. I'm talking about jewels and fabric and luxury beyond compare, but at the same time, he was in exile and hoping to return to a restored monarchy after the Bolshevik Revolution, and it turns out, according to correspondents I unearthed, Chanel thought she might marry this duke and then become the Empress of Russia.
Love it.
That didn't work out, obviously. She dated the wealthiest man in Europe, the Duke of Westminster, for many years, who introduced her to international royal society, who was himself politically rather suspect, actually, who took her fishing, hunting, gave her her own textile mill to make Scottish tweeds, and there we see the influence of his world on the clothes that we still enjoy today of Chanel's, those famous tweed suits.
Here's the thing that's fascinating to me. Many things, of course, are in terms of her, but I want to get back to this abandonment issue because the men that she chose to involve herself with were never men who could really give her themselves.
No.
So, it's interesting that as a child, it's the abandonment thing, and of all the things that she accomplished in her life, that she couldn't throw away. She was still hammered by her father, abandonment, and, and by no fault of her own, her mother's as well. She couldn't overcome that, could she?
I don't think so, Halli. It was the single biggest tragedy of her life, but I think it was combined also with the fact that she was so unusual in being a peasant, actually literally of the peasant class, who then rose to the highest realm of society in Europe at the time. There were really no men, virtually. I can't imagine a man who would have married her in her day, even though she had befriended so many people of the highest society. While she was still a young woman, she could become lovers with these men. And yes, I agree absolutely, the psychological effect of her father's abandonment was being replayed over and over again. That's clear. But also the social class structure of France had not changed enough for men of rank, privilege, and aristocracy to seriously consider marrying a peasant, even if she was the famous Coco Chanel. It was a double whammy.
And she must have known that, no?
She did know that. And she spoke often of the difficulty in having no provenance, if you will, of having no lineage in France. She said that she thought foreigners were welcomed in France more easily than French people who did not have family background.
Fascinating. What was it about her, seriously, that so enamored people of her? What, is it nameable?
I've thought a lot about that. I think Chanel was a genius at emulation. And when I say emulation, I mean that she could play both sides of the drama of emulation, which involves copying someone and creating something that other people desperately want to copy themselves. It's a theatrical game. It's part charisma, part savvy, and then a kind of X factor that, yes, maybe we cannot name, but I think she drew people to her by knowing how to mirror them in a way, and then somehow altering whatever it was she was mirroring to make them suddenly want to be like her. And she did it over and over and over again. She had a vampire-like quality, really.
Oh, that's an interesting choice of words, my friend. My goodness, vampire. Let's talk Chanel and anti-Semitism and Nazism and fascism. And you were warned about looking into the politics of Chanel, weren't you?
Multiple times, yes.
And I like a girl who says, too bad, I'm going there. You went there. Talk to me.
I had to go there, Halli, for many reasons. We do know from research that had been done before me that Chanel got involved in a kind of abortive espionage mission for the Nazis during World War II, and that she had a lover who was a high-ranking Nazi officer. Those things are indisputable. We also knew for a long time that she had been called to account by the so-called purgation committees of France, but she was released. What interested me even beyond that, though, is her larger relationship to fascism, anti-Semitism, and Germany. I think that her fashion itself, the movement that so entrances us still, that uniform, that mass replicability, owes a great deal to the appeal of fascism at the time. So I think that the politics she was drawn to, which, by the way, have to do with wanting to be in the in crowd, the powerful crowd, the elite, and even a little bit of brutality, also have to be taken into account when we look at the fashions that lingered on. And I also uncovered new research that suggests, honestly, that even as early as World War I, she may have been working for the Germans then, too.
Really?
Yeah. There was a police file on her that says expressly that.
Let me throw this out at you, because this is a thought that I had, see what you have to say about it. And that is, one of the things that I also see in her life from reading, particularly your book, is that she seemed to embrace the things that she feared rather than run from them.
That's a brilliant observation. I hadn't put it to myself that way, but I think that's correct. And I can, as soon as you say that, I see that I agree with you. For example, she did not know how to swim, but she learned that Aristide loved boating, and so she forced herself to be a good sailor. She thought oysters were disgusting and forced herself to eat them. These are minor examples, because she learned that that's what the upper class did. And on a much more serious scale, I think she figured out that in order to overcome her background, she would have to plunge into every unknown, every danger, and she trusted herself because she was strong enough to have survived that childhood. I think it gave her trust in her own capacities, but that did not make her happy necessarily. She was wildly successful, but actually never happy.
I want to talk to you about that in a little bit, but let's go on just and get a couple of other things that I think are relevant to this conversation. The book is filled with Chanel quotes. Hers, a lot of people say that it was a publicist's dream who came up with these quotes that she bantered around so much. How much of her is contrived versus how much is the true Chanel?
Oh, well, she was a publicist's dream in a way, but she was her own publicist. There has never been a publicist as ingenious as Coco Chanel. So all the quotations in my book are quite genuinely her own. Whether they accurately represent her life is another matter. She was a spin artist before we had such a term. And she was a brilliant woman who was quite snappy with a line, according to everyone who knew her. She could throw back a retort very quickly. Her description of her life, her autobiographical remarks, were never to be taken literally.
Control. Pretty controlling lady, huh? Don't you like understatement? Is that understatement on my part?
Big understatement. She was a control maniac. But, again, you can understand how a girl who had no control over her life, who lived in a routinized, extremely oppressive childhood home, would seek to reverse that situation as soon as she could.
She was summoned to Hollywood. She went. Not such a great marriage there, huh?
No, that's a very interesting story because, of course, America would later provide her with great success. But in the 1930s, Samuel Goldwyn invited her to MGM to do costumes for a number of films, which she did. And they are very attractive costumes, but they look exactly like her regular clothes. And that was not what they wanted in Hollywood at the time. If you have seen any 1930s movies, you know that women wore marabou stoles and white satin gowns while sipping coffee in the kitchen in every scene. It was an extravagant time. It was an attempt to offset the Depression. And Chanel's muted, elegant clothes were not a hit in Hollywood, and she left. And she was equally disgruntled with Hollywood. She thought it was a ridiculous place at the time.
Her influence extends beyond the long life of her company. And as you say in the book, I'm going to quote, she's been woven deeply into global consciousness. Her name remains as recognizable today as it was a century ago. Why?
Yes, I think the reason is that Chanel tapped into something that's much deeper than a fashion longing. I think Chanel hit women where they live. She understood deeply what it means to want to fit in, Halli, and fit in every sense, not just fashionably, but socially, psychologically, erotically. And she invented a look and a lifestyle that goes along with the look, a kind of theatrical role for women that was universally delicious. And we will never get over the desire to fit in and also blend in and be appropriate. Every woman who's had to wonder what to wear to a cocktail party and come up with a little black dress, or what to wear to that business meeting and worn a little business suit, has channeled the spirit of Coco Chanel.
By 30, she was a household name in France. By age 40, she had become a multimillionaire and a household name. Mm-hmm. Let's get to the bottom line. Was she a happy camper? Was she ever a happy woman? And is there any truth to the drug stories that abound around her?
I think sadly the answer is no. Chanel was never a happy woman. I think she had moments of happiness briefly in her early 30s when she was in love with Boy Capel. I think she took pleasure in her success, but no, she herself said she was profoundly unhappy. And unfortunately, it does seem as though from around the age of 52 or so to the end of her life, she had some kind of addiction to an opium-derived sleep medication called Sedal, perhaps more extensive even than just that medication. But yeah, there seems to be reason to believe she had a morphine-related drug addiction, but she was highly functional nonetheless.
I love the fact that you so well describe the seductive nature of her, even in death. I love that part. I just love it. How other biographers have been seduced by her, and you were honest to say that you too had to fight succumbing to her influence, even in death. So what does that say about the power of this woman?
Well, I think it's about a power she harnessed that was bigger than herself. And I do say honestly early on in the book that any one of us women who've been raised reading fashion magazines cannot help feeling seduced. When I was invited to meet with Chanel executives and I got to walk up those stairs, the famous carpeted spiral staircase at the House of Chanel, and sat on